Washington can have a top 5 offense in the Big Ten this fall.
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back in to another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Tomashoff. That's Lars Hanson. He writes with me over at Huskies Wire. Thank you for making this your first watch or first listen of the day, as we are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And just a quick reminder, wherever you get this podcast, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, make sure to click that subscribe button, click that little bell as well, so you don't miss when we post a new show. Plus, if you're on the audio only side of things, please make sure to leave us a 5-star review, as all that really does help the show out a lot. Now, Lars, you and I have a lot of fun stuff that we wanted to get to on this episode. We're going to talk about just some of our notes now that we are 1 week removed from spring practice. Got a few more before Jedd Fisch shuts things down and they get into the flow of the season. We'll get to that in a little bit. We've got a big question that we wanted to pose. Will a true freshman start a game for Washington this season, not on special teams? We'll get to that in a little bit, but the big question, and as Lars can attest to, I was having a lot of fun doing the math over here because Washington is not as far off as you might think. Can Washington build a top 5 offense in the Big Ten this fall?
Absolutely. I think once we started going through those numbers and you were kind of throwing a few out, I'm like, I was off by 3 on a couple of the guesses. And to me, it was like, yeah, they're actually not that far off. And especially when you consider having a full season with Dezmen, that is really what it comes down to, where last season you could see the potential, you could see Denzel being there, but then having the fall off to the end of last season. Now you have, Omari, Rashid, all those guys outside. All the pieces are absolutely there. And it also starts with the offensive line. Like, everything has been improved, whether, people think so or not, as, we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks here. Everything has been improved along the offense, even Jedd's play calling from what we've seen in practice. So to me, everything is in play to make that happen.
So you talk about play calling. I'm sure that's going to be a big part of this discussion as well. As the Everdares know, we mentioned that last week too. So let's run through some of these numbers. Total offense. Washington finished 6th in the Big Ten last season at 390.6 yards per game. Indiana finished 5th at 426.4. Bit of a gap there. Wasn't that much of a gap between 1 and 5, and then 5 and 6, about 30 yards, was one of the bigger ones that I noted on the list. Let's get to points. Points is where we really need to see a difference, but this is where it gets interesting. USC finished 5th at 30.2 points per game. Washington finished 12th at 23.4. But this is where I was having a lot of fun. Washington went 26 of 47 in the red zone and scoring touchdowns. Those 47 red zone drives finished 10th among Big Ten teams. So let's say you add 15 to that, right? Damon Williams and this offense and again, this improved offensive line that we want to get to, can certainly account for somewhere between 10, 12, one extra red zone drive per game. Let's just say 13, just like it was last season. And if you could add 13 red zone drives and 13 more touchdowns in those drives, that makes up that touchdown difference that you see, where all of a sudden 23.4 turns into 30.4. And then you're ahead of USC, and then you're in 5th. And we're not saying that's exactly how the season is going to play out. That's not how it works. But this is just showing that, even despite having such a poor offensive line, especially in the back half of the season last year, Washington had so many things go against them. And if you're able to improve the play calling, we know the offensive line is set to take a step forward. The numbers show that this team is not nearly as far off from being one of the Big Ten's elite as some people might think.
It's really not. And I think it goes into some of the other metrics that we were talking about before the show, where third down conversion, staying on the field. That's where a lot of this comes into play, where you mentioned the red zone. Well, the only way you can get to the red zone is by staying on the field. And I think they were 15th in third down conversions in the Big Ten last season, around, I think they were just above Wisconsin. And fair to say, I think that number should go up this season. They'd probably, even if they finish around 9th in third down conversions, that's still, you're probably adding 2-3 more drives per game. And then we're talking about one of those 3 or 2 of those 3 being a touchdown. That's where your, 17 or 7 to 10 points comes into play right there. Like, there's so many factors that are right there on the edge, but this last season wasn't right there.
So you mentioned 2 to 3 drives per game. Obviously, yes, third down conversions play a big factor into that. But I think what's honestly more important is what we talked about on yesterday's show. the defense is set to take a big step forward, especially the defensive line and how many bodies you have at that position and what that could look like this fall if you're able to be better at stopping third downs, especially third and shorts, and you're able to stop the run and cut down that another 15th in the Big Ten number in 161.8 yards per game on the ground. If you can cut that down by 25, 30 yards as well, which is certainly very possible with an improved defensive line, all of a sudden that gives DeMond Williams more possessions. That gives Jedd Fisch more opportunities to open up the playbook a little bit and just, utilize a Doak Walker Award watch list nominee in Jonah Coleman, a Bolitnikoff Award watch list nominee in Denzel Boston, and just provide some of these guys with more opportunities to make plays. And this is where I was really interested in why I harped on this so heavily last season. I know you did as well, is when you and I would talk about through the first 8 games, Washington outgained their opponents in each of those contests. That's why we talked about it. It shows that what Jedd Fisch was bringing to the table in terms of overall scheme, not specific play calling, was working. That's why there are so many different things that you can point to and say, yes, this is a good long-term outlook. That's a good long-term outlook. And you look at where it all really fell apart with the offensive line. It was because that group was thrown together with a couple guys coming off torn ACLs and a bunch of other people that just transferred into the program. Like, it was really, really difficult to put that group together through just the spring transfer portal period. So I look at especially where that unit is going and what we've seen from it so far in fall camp. It's like I say about the defensive line. You don't need it to be elite, right? Obviously, you're not going to complain if it is, but yeah, shocker, right? But if it's average to slightly above average, that provides you with enough of a step forward when you can take all of these skill players into consideration and what they can do. And it provides for all of these gaps in the numbers that we're talking about.
Absolutely. And I think, another kind of unit you can throw in special teams where if, you're talking about kickoff returns, if you're able to get a, better return average, get the ball, get the starting drive position, 5 to 10 more yards, whether you're starting at the 30, maybe 32, it's all these incremental differences because like you started the show with, they're not really as far off as you would think, but there's so many areas in which you kind of have to play it has to play a role where whether 2 or 3 come to fruition, that's where all this starts, where you have all the pieces in place and you went and you hired a special teams coordinator, Chris Petrelli. You went and hired a new defensive coordinator, Ryan Walters. So you're investing in all these things. That's why Jedd did that, so he can make sure there's no excuses come season to make all these things come to fruition.
I like that you mentioned this no excuses thing because I think that so much of this, it lends to something you wrote about over on Huskies Wire with Greg McElroy talking about how bold it was to name DeMond the face of the program when he did, because so much of this comes back to DeMond. And I think about this in Jedd Fisch terms, like the NFL, where you have a particular winning window. Like the Texans and CJ Stroud is a great example, even though they're just a mess of an organization, where you have a really talented young quarterback on a team-friendly, controllable deal. It's about finding ways to put all those pieces around him in such a short amount of time before you have to pony up and give him the big check, or in this case, DeMond leaves for the NFL. That's what this is all about, and Jedd Fisch has done such a good job of that. Obviously, when he got to Washington, he has a couple of really nice pieces, whether it's on the offensive line and Paki Finau, tight end and Decker DeGraff, wide receiver and Denzel Boston, some of these guys that have stayed over on defense as well. But there are so many pieces around. And then you bring in a coaching staff where, we've seen John Richardson get the most out of the guys in the secondary, which is something that was not happening under the previous regime. We've seen so many other different changes where it really is molding some of the talent that was left over on the roster, plus Jedd Fisch identifying new talent and bringing other talent with him. And it's created something that really could take a huge step forward this season.
It's all about competition, and one of the themes of most pro programs, and certainly Jedd's, where, you can retain some guys, and obviously usually when a new staff comes in, they prefer their new guys to the guys that they're bringing in. But Jedd's given, Kalen's guys, Paki, like you mentioned, Landen, obviously. Like he knew who the pieces were. There's probably some questions that he had. I think, maybe like Justice Williams, guys like that'll play smaller roles, but it's all there. And I think Jedd's probably the perfect coach to make that kind of mend together where you're meshing the right system with the right roster and guys. And then the ones that are missing, you just kind of sprinkle them in. And I think that's kind of what we've seen.
And then that brings us to another question. Is there a place for a true freshman in any of this? And we'll get to that right after a message from our good friends over at FanDuel. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights like me, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting. You're already following the action. Why not make it a little more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned at the beach, which is great news for all you Husky fans out there, because Washington's win total of 7.5, quite frankly, I think that's too low. And if you're buying in after what we were just talking about regarding the offense taking a big step forward, I highly recommend you go and you check it out, because 7.5 with the way the schedule shapes up and the talent on this roster, I think that's a slam dunk. New to FanDuel, new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. Lars, you and I have spent a lot of time talking about true freshmen. Now, it's not like we're sitting here just trying to pump some of these guys up. We have been very, very impressed with what they've brought to the table. Dezmen Roebuck being a prime example of that. I don't think his name is going to come up in this conversation. No slight to him. It's just Washington already has a really talented group of receivers. But John Mills took a lot of first-team reps. I think he took all the first-team reps during Tuesday's practice, as we record this on Wednesday, with practice being back on Thursday after an off day. But I look around and I just see guys like him. I see Rylon Dillard-Allen at safety. Zadris Rainey-Saleh was someone who's in that discussion for me before the knee injury happened. I just look at all these different positions and I say, can a true freshman start this fall? I wanted to say no, but I'm starting to talk myself into yes, and I'll explain why after I hear your answer.
I think there's a couple guys. I mean, the overarching is going to be really hard, but I think Rylon is the guy that I could see starting a game or two just because of the way he's making an impact in fall camp and the way he plays. He's playing not like a freshman. I think that would be the way to put it. Obviously, you mentioned Dezmen. In any other year, in any other roster, Dezmen would be obviously starting just because of the way he's balling out right now. But I look at that depth chart and I'm like, man, if he cracks the two deeps, I'd almost be surprised. And again, that's not a slight to Dezmen. That's just the number of guys ahead of him. But going down that list, I mean, you can just run through the positions. Tight end, I would love to see Barron start, but I don't know if that's going to happen. Like, there's so many positions where, I might see a game, but it's like, it's just really hard to find where and when.
Yeah, so I like where you're going, because I think the more I think about it, the more I think the answer might be yes, but I don't think it's Rylon, because like I said at the top, we excluded special teams from this because it's not like the special teams doesn't matter, but that doesn't necessarily count for what we're talking about here. I think that it might be one of the offensive linemen, where I think that would give some people some pause, but the more I look at it, I was having a conversation with a good friend of mine earlier today about John Mills, and just it took me back to a conversation that you and I had on the sidelines last April when Marcus Bryant was visiting. And if we didn't know which was which, we would think that John Mills was the all-conference left tackle that was coming in on a visit. So I think that's something that does matter here, because if he's able to just very quickly get up to speed physically, which we certainly have seen him do at times where there's still some technical things that need refinement, which is, not shocking because he's a true freshman. But if Jedd, Fisch, and this coaching staff are comfortable with that, let's say it's the Purdue game later in the year, right? Or it's just one of these other games later in the season, Rutgers, whoever else it might be, where it's not necessarily a top tier opponent. I wouldn't be surprised if that's something that they try with John, or maybe with Champ Taulealea as well, because we already know how high this coaching staff is on those guys. But on top of that, I just think that it's a really nice way to plan for the future. Like when you talk about Rylon Dillard-Allen at safety, it's something I mentioned on yesterday's show too, where I felt so vindicated seeing Rylon and Alex McLaughlin, which is in my opinion, already written in pen, the starting combination for 2026 back there. That's what it's going to be next season. Like, we're going to see John, Champ, or maybe even both starting on this offensive line next fall. So why not find a way to throw them in there this fall if they're already up to the task and you feel like you can trust them? I think that that's the position that I would go with.
I agree with that because it made me think of Landen Hatchett, where we talked about, I think, a week or two ago, where if Landen, ends up losing that job to Champ and around the Purdue game, like you mentioned, I wouldn't be surprised at all. Not because Landen couldn't handle it, but I just think Champ should be growing enough throughout the season. He'll be getting game reps, and we've seen it in practice where they have no problem throwing him in there. And I think that's another guy where we both love John Mills. It's just the hard part is Pocky Fino is also a sophomore, so it's like you're looking at it and thinking, like, one of those two guys is going to be a starter for a couple of years. One of those two should probably be at a different position just to make sure they can both be on the field at the same time. But to your point, I think somehow John's going to find a way to start at least a game or two.
So let's talk about that, because that's something that I like that you brought that up, because that's something that's really important for me too, because, we've talked about 2026 and what this roster is going to look like when Cody Green gets here too. But I kind of look around and I say, Champ's a bona fide guard, and John and Pocky can both kick out to tackle if you want. I think they might prefer John now just because of his size, but like Pocky can absolutely play the position. We know that very well. I don't know if they want to keep him on the inside moving forward. But then again, this kind of just plays into my point too, because if you want to try him out at one of these guard spots, and then, maybe later in the games, we saw him take some tackle reps during the spring. We haven't seen nearly as much of it this fall, mainly because I think they're preparing for him to not start at guard, but just play that position this fall at some point in time, whether it be late in games or maybe as part of a rotation. I think that's yet to be seen, but I think that's something that can't go unnoticed here, because one of those guys is going to kick out to tackle when Carver Willis graduates at the end of the year.
And I think also Carver being, senior, and then you have Max McCready, you want to keep kind of those two guys at left tackle, and so that's why John Mills, I don't think, has gotten that kick out just yet. But man, I wonder, because it's almost unfortunate where the non-conference games come early in the season, where if you had that ability to,
with that SEC schedule,
I was gonna say, as much as we bash on that, it's like that is the only caveat. Like if you could play Mercer in early November, that would be a perfect game to say, hey, you know what? You've gotten some game reps. Now let's start these guys, because, by the way, there's no way we're losing to Mercer. And no fight to Mercer. That's sorry for catching spray there. But just that when you mentioned the SEC schedule, that was the first one that comes to mind. But yeah, I think one of those two, they're going to have to find a way. But also, you have to wonder, maybe does Carver kick over to right if Drew struggles? So
I don't think so.
I don't think so either. But I'm just saying, there's only so many factors that would allow him to kick out. And I just think he's going to be hard pressed for it. But I feel like, knowing Jedd, he's going to try and find a way to at least test him, much like where, they tested DeMond in certain situations last season. I could see that happening this season with John Mills or somebody else.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like it's a little bit different in terms of offensive line versus quarterback, where it's a lot easier to, pull them off and put them back on at, different circumstances. I think about like the 2-minute drive against Wazoo where they wanted him to run that, or just some of the different little plays where they put him in for that like double pass against Michigan, or just some of those other things where it's very easy to, it still feels weird saying this because it's a quarterback, but it's easier to take that guy off and put him back on the field at different points in time compared to an offensive lineman, where I think if you're going to go that route with him, it's going to be somewhat drive related, where, maybe he gets a drive and then Guerin gets a drive or something like that. That's kind of where I could see that coming into play a little bit more, just because so much of good offensive line play is just based on chemistry.
Yeah, and actually, as you were saying all that, if you think about it, who would John have to beat out? Because Sewane Fasolo's been the backup right tackle and Max McCree's been the backup left tackle. Max could kick over to right because we saw that happen last season, and all of a sudden now you're talking about a Justin Hilcom, John Mills battle for that backup left tackle spot. And I think that would be a path where I could also see that coming to fruition. But I mean, again, you're talking about having so much young talent. It's just, I think as we go through the season, we just seen John Mills and especially Champ as well, right guard, progress so much that I have a hard time envisioning them not continue to see that growth as the season goes along. So Jedd's going to have to find a way to get creative, because they're going to find a way on the field one way or another.
And this just goes back to another thing that we were talking about the other day, is that there is so much promising young depth. When you look around this roster, it feels like you can have that conversation at pretty much every single position, where it's, oh, hey, this guy's getting pushed by that, redshirt freshman or sophomore or whoever else. And we're going to get to that and so many more things that have stood out to us on the practice field after 1 week. Lars, what are some of the things in your notes that you wanted to bring to the table?
So I wanted to talk about, because as we're talking about the young receiver room and just kind of the young guys in general, I think looking at both Justice and Desi Jose, where I thought Desi would have the production Dezmen is having. And I think that is what is kind of intriguing me about the outside receiver room, where just knowing how good Desi was on film, knowing how good some of those, guys were, I'm curious to see how it comes to fruition. Because when we looked in spring, it was, Marcus Harris, Chris Lawson, Raiden Vines-Bright. And now it's almost like, man, who's going to end up emerging from that room? I'm just looking at the young receivers because as we led the show with, building a top 5 offense, it starts with the product outside. Obviously, you have to have the quarterback, no doubt about that. But I'm just curious to see how can these guys, find a way to use this season to build into next season, because a lot of these guys aren't going to see the field, especially a receiver, just A, because of the way the offense is styled, and B, who's already on the roster. But there's so much young talent in that room. I'm curious to see how Kevin Cummings and Jedd Fisch are going to balance this compared to how they did last season with Audric and obviously Jason Robinson and Justice Williams, but which was a completely different scenario than what they're going to experience this season. So I'm just curious, how are they going to end up building those guys in? I'm just curious to see how it comes to happen.
So you pose a good question, because the answer that I could think of while you were talking about all that is a lot of that is probably going to happen behind closed doors, which is the unfortunate thing, right? Where, obviously the media doesn't get to watch practice during the season. They don't get to see game prep or different things like that. So I feel like outside of, a coach or a player mentions this guy in a press conference, we might not see much of that. And that's why, as high as I am on Justice Williams, I'm fully prepared to not see much of him on the field this fall. And then all of a sudden next spring, I always think of like those silly like Twitter aggregators over being like, oh, this guy looks like he's going to be a problem. It's like, we're going to see some of those clips about Justice Williams coming out at this time next spring. So I hear what you're talking about with Desi Jose, where it's just all about that progression that we're going to see in this first year. Cause I feel like one guy who you and I were very interested to see what it was going to look like last fall. And then obviously there were some injuries and other things that got in the way, was Jordan Washington. And then we just kind of had to be patient and just let that process play out. And this fall it's, okay, yeah, we see why Scotty Graham spent all spring talking about him and all summer just kind of being like, yeah, this is a guy who's going to help us out a lot. So I think that's something that, at the receiver position, there are certainly things we've already talked about. Dezmen Roebuck, Marcus Harris, I know he's been sidelined with an injury recently. Chris Lawson, who's been also sidelined, and then Raiden Vines-Bright. Like, there's so much talent at that position right now without even mentioning the veteran guys, the Rashid Williamses, the Omari Evanses, Denzel Boston. So we're going to have to just be a little bit patient. And as much as you and I have been able to see, it's going to take a little bit of time, which I think is the fun. And that's all part of college football, is this development process and letting the cream rise to the top whenever these guys are ready to take that next step, which we've seen already with Denzel Boston after 2 years sitting behind Rome Odunze. So I do like where you're going with that. One guy I wanted to throw at you as we stay on this theme of young guys here is Dylan Robinson. There have been some ups and downs. He's allowed a couple of touchdowns. I know UW put out that clip of Dezmen Roebuck making that fantastic diving play to end practice, which he was working against Dylan Robinson. There have been a couple other ones like that where Dylan has been in coverage, but I kind of look at it and I see a true freshman who got here in June that is still very much learning the speed of the game and a few different things.
Absolutely. I mean, that was going to be one of the guys in the last segment where wouldn't he be a true freshman that could start? And it's like, we would have thought so, but it's
somewhere else, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I think, again, it's not a lack of Dylan's talent. I think we certainly see the size, talent, ability, all those things, but there is a learning curve, especially when you come in June. I think had he been an early enrollee, and it's no slight to Dylan about that.
I agree.
Had he come in the spring, I think this would be a much different discussion, but it's also good that he did come in June, because you don't really need him this spring, or this fall, because you have the 2 twin towers outside, plus Leroy, plus the guys behind him. I think there's enough depth built up there to where you didn't need to thrust him in, day one of fall camp saying, hey, we need to, we need to send him like they're doing with Rylon. But it's also kind of just I don't know if it's not clicking, but I think there's just a little bit of.
It's not that.
And exactly. I don't think it's that. I think it's just a little bit of, hey, he's going to take a little bit of lumps, but he's going to get there pretty quick.
Oh, I agree. And that's one of the things too, where, you talk about that progression and watching these guys grow as they get more acclimated to the speed of college football. Because you talk about, just where you mention the aspect of not bringing that guy in January because he didn't want to thrust him in too early. So I disagree there, because that's something you and I have been talking about, where it's that guy is someone who this coaching staff believes is a future starter, probably as soon as next year. Like, you just listen to the way the coaching staff talks about him. I can't remember if it was Jedd Fisch or Ryan Walters went kind of out of his way the other day to mention, oh yeah, that guy had the largest broad jump on the team during summer conditioning. Like, he's clearly a freak athlete who they are really excited about. And at that size, he fits this scheme so well. So, in terms of where we talk about John Mills and Taulealea, thrusting those guys in to try them out in different settings, why would you not want to do that with Dylan Robinson? And that's where I think that a spring certainly could have helped him. And it's never a player's fault if they're unable to enroll in the spring. But I look at that scenario and say, we might see a few more of those, where I think back to what Carver Willis told us in the spring of, I was playing right tackle for so long, I don't quite feel it yet. Well, when moving to my left and everything. And there are going to be a couple times where I do the rep and I'm going to feel it and it's going to click. And I feel like we're going to see that same thing with Dylan Robinson. And once it does click, there's going to be no turning back.
Exactly. It's almost going to be like a wave cresting, where once you finally get over the wave, then now you're just off on the sails. And I think there's so many guys you could really consider that with, where, I think about Jonathan Epperson and, when Dangerous is able to fully get going, those two guys as well, because they have the size, they have all the physical tools. It's just a matter of, when is it going to click? When is it going to come together? Because like another freshman that we already talked about, Dezmen, almost seems like it's already clicked. It's just a matter of when can you find the field, which is the problem that he's going to have with the guys above him. But that's what really is kind of the theme that I've noticed. Another theme entirely about fall camp, the football IQ of this roster. When we talk about the offense, going top five, whatever, it's like every single position. I haven't heard a single coach, not counting Chris Pacelli, just generally yelling overall, but just saying, you're out of assignment. You're not doing this right. You're not doing this right. And especially for, the first week of fall camp, sometimes that's a little more understandable. I think that's a major statement for this program and why we're kind of one of the underlying reasons why we're so high on it.
No, I love that. That is a really good call out, because it's something I think of, when we're talking about recruits, right? Where I was saying this to somebody the other day, where we get into this habit of using certain buzzwords. It's like, oh, this guy's really athletic. Oh, he does this really well. He does that really well. And I kind of catch myself and I say to myself, am I overstating this? Like, am I just saying the same thing over and over again because that's what works here? And then I go back and I watch the film and I say, oh, no, this is why I said that. That's why I said that. And I feel like it's the same exact thing with the football IQ, because we hear it all the time from this coaching staff of, oh yeah, we're really happy with this guy's football IQ. We're really happy with that guy's football IQ. It shows up a lot, where I feel like I can count on one hand the amount of like bad throws I've seen or bad decisions these quarterbacks have made over the course of fall camp. Demond did have one on Tuesday when he threw that pick to Ephesians Prysock because he threw it into double coverage. It just kind of seemed like an ill-advised throw. But those are going to happen, and it's about learning from those mistakes. And that's the thing. This group seems to be very, very good at learning from these mistakes and not making them again.
And it was a theme that we saw from Demond last season, where I don't think he made the same mistake twice in a game. And that's, kind of a hallmark of Jedd Fisch, where that's why him, with his NFL experience and all those sorts of things, he's going to harp on that. He's going to make sure, all right, you can make that mistake once, but, don't fool me twice, sort of thing. And I think also, having all the veterans, kind of battling with some of the young guys, like, think about Kai Horton backing up Demond, another guy who can keep Demond honest. Not that Demond's job is threatened in any way, shape, or form by Kai, but it's just good to kind of have somebody else there right by you, and especially a veteran like Landen Hatchett and Taulealea, where you have that dynamic where you want both guys to push each other, but there's no either one that's truly threatened. And I think that's where it's all kind of stemming from.
So are there any other shout outs? Because I literally just thought of one. I had a whole bunch of lists that I want to get through, but I'm pivoting from that for the time being.
Not necessarily. I do think the linebackers I do want to kind of touch on for maybe 30 seconds.
Yeah, that was on my list.
Because I'm looking at that group and I'm thinking, we keep asking every now and then, hey, is Jake Amani going to play? And all these sorts of things. There's so much talent in that room. Again, we're at, when I mentioned Jonathan Epperson, another guy where we thought might see the field, maybe not as much, just because the bodies in front of him and the way this defense is structured, like Budalucha, my word. Like, I think he's going to be
so
an NFL guy. Like, I know he had some NFL prospects. I think this coaching staff with Brian Odom and Ryan Walter's scheme, he is going to be a day 2 pick at least, if not, potentially even better.
I don't know if it's going to get that far, mainly because of his size. I think that's something that will be a little bit limiting, but the production is going to be there. Where I remember when he did transfer over here, Washington State fans were like, oh, he missed so many tackles. He did this, he did that. I feel like the coaching will be able to help get those right. And it's one of those things where, especially when you go to a 5 down front, he is going to have so much freedom in this scheme, and he will be able to show his ability as a ball hawk, his ability to just constantly find the ball, flow through gaps, do all these different things that the coaching staff is asking from him. And if he does end up as, a day 2, I can never rule out day 3 with these guys that are always undersized in a position. But if he does end up being an NFL draft pick, I'm not going to be shocked because he does have that kind of talent. The one guy I wanted to mention is, we've spent so much time talking about some of the younger guys that we maybe haven't gotten a chance to see or have taken steps forward in ways that certainly need to be shouted out. One guy who I think has taken a big step forward and looks really comfortable and is probably, I was going to say the most important player on the team. He's certainly the most important player in his position group, is Landen Hatchett. I think that he's somebody who, now that he's back in his natural position of center, has gotten a full year to recover from the ACL. It's the year after, and those common football terminology words. On top of that, he just looks like he is so comfortable running this offense. He's the guy who everyone just always seems to gravitate towards, and he's a really good leader and is the one who I think is going to end up holding this group together no matter who's playing next to him.
Yeah, he's absolutely the anchor of this offensive line, both in terms of personality and play style. I think that's why Landen is so pivotal to this unit, where you have the veterans to kind of help support him. Obviously, older brothers Gary coming back, but just Landen, like, his aura really just screams like, I am going to bring this whole thing together. And he looks like an offensive lineman, certainly. But just, I think I'm glad you shouted him out, because him having that full offseason from spring, summer, fall, coming off last season, I think everything is trending in the upwards for Landen, and I think that's why the offensive line is going to be so good this season.
Lars, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank to all Everdares for tuning in. We really do appreciate your support. We got so much more fun stuff coming for you throughout fall camp, so please make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, whether that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere. We're updating this channel with new content every single day, so please make sure you click that like button, click that little bell, so you never miss when we post a new show. Plus, if you got any questions, comments, concerns, drop them right down below in the comment section, and if you're audio only, please make sure to leave us a 5-star review. For a couple of you out there, thank you for making this your last listen of the day, and until next time, we'll talk to you on Friday.